Good morning, good afternoon, perhaps for some of you, perhaps even good evening. My name is Elżbieta Matynia. I'm a professor of sociology and liberal studies at the New School for Social Research in New York, and the director of the Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies. I am in New York currently, and I will be moderating today the American launch of the book by Agnieszka Koscianska, Gender, Pleasure, and Violence, which was just published by the Indiana University Press. I like to ask the most important person in this meeting, Lala Pop, to tell us how we are going to manage that 1 hour and what is that you, our audience, and also we should know about technical aspects of that and logistics of that meeting. Lala.
Thank you, Elżbieta, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The most important thing is that we're recording this event. So if you're asking your questions and they are read out loud, they will also be recorded. Pay attention, please, to the chat, because I will put some good information there, including link to a discount for the book that we're discussing today. And also some information about how you can tag us on Facebook or on other social media if you're tweeting, for example, about this event. The Q&A section at the end of the hour will occur all on the bottom of your screen in the Q&A. You can place your questions from your account, or you can place them anonymously. And Professor Jeffrey Goldfarb will be the one monitoring the Q&A. So thank you again for joining us. Please keep an eye on the chat and enjoy the discussion.
Again, I'm delighted to be here with you on behalf of the Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies, the Democracy Seminar of the New School for Social Research, as well as the Gender and Sexuality Studies Institute at the New School. But it is really wonderfully rewarding to have Agnieszka Koscianska with us today, as Agnieszka has very close ties to the New School. As a graduate student at Warsaw University, she participated in our Democracy and Diversity Institute in Krakow in 2004. And then she spent a semester at the New School 2 years later. Agnieszka, who is now associate professor in the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology, Warsaw University, is going to speak to us from Oxford, where she is the Leveron visiting professor at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. When we were planning this meeting in 2019, we were sure we will have it at the New School, was probably at the Wolf Conference Room and not in cyberspace, but here we are. Agnieszka authored several volumes on gender and sexuality, including the monograph, and that I think was her PhD thesis, Power of Silence, Gender and Religious Conversion in Poland. Her most recent book, To See a Moose, The History of Polish Sex Education from the First Class to the Internet, which was published in Poland in 2017, is about to come up in English in Berkan Books. You will meet Agnieszka in a second. Let me just say that in conversation with Agnieszka will be two distinguished feminist scholars, our friends and longtime collaborators, Maria Bukur and Shirin Hassem. The book we will be talking about again is entitled Gender, Pleasure, and Violence. Gender, pleasure, and violence. And again, was just published by the Indiana University Press. Let me just say a word about Maria Bukur, who is John W. Hill Professor of East European History and Gender Studies at Indiana University. She is the author of Birth of Democratic Citizenship, Women and Power in Modern Romania, published just 2 years ago, and other works focusing on Eastern European history and gender. Her newest book, The Nation's Gratitude, War and Citizenship in Interwar Romania, is forthcoming from Rutledge University Press. I shall add that Maria is also a member of the Democracy Seminar. Shirin Hassem is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. She accepted this position while being professor at the Wits University in Johannesburg in South Africa. Today, she is going to talk with us, to us from Toronto, but she's also a visiting professor at Weiser, which is Wits University's Center for Studies, as well as the Senior Research Fellow at TCDS. A distinguished scholar in African Studies, Shireen is a very long time partner in convening and teaching at the Democracy and Diversity Institutes in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Wrocław. Her work focuses on feminist theory and politics, social policies and gender, but also on collective action and histories of mobilization of women in Africa. Again, there are many books. I will just mention two: No Shortcuts to Power, Women in Policymaking in Africa, but also well known in the United States, Women's Organizations and Democracy, Contesting Authority. I shall add that Shireen will be teaching this July at our New York Wrocław cyberspace, the Democracy and Diversity Institute this summer. So we'll turn to Agnieszka, and we will ask her to talk to us about the book, to introduce the book to us. And then we will have Maria and Shireen to join in conversation about the book. And I will be there too, a little bit the background. We will again dedicate some time to questions, and Professor Jeff Goldfarb will be helping us with identifying the questions. So before I will ask, okay, Agnieszka.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction and for organizing this. Many thanks to all my co-panelists to being here, and also to Jeff for organizing this. And let me just, and it's really a pleasure to be here, although only virtually. As Elżbieta said, my first contact with the TCDS was back in 2004, so 15 years ago. So let me just say a few words about the book. This book is about the development of sexology in Poland, the development of expert knowledge of sexuality in socialist and post-socialist Poland. So I'm tracing this since the 1970s, late 1960s and the 70s, and I'm showing the very specific methods that were developed by Polish sexologists. So Polish sexology in the 70s and 80s was really humanistic and was patient-oriented, and there was a lot of space for voices of patients and of people who wrote letters to sex experts to share their concerns, their troubles, and their opinions on various issues. And sexologists really took into account what their patients and their correspondents wanted to tell them. So as a result, the methods, the approach to sexuality represented by Polish sexologists back in the 1970s was really humanistic and holistic, and we could say it today sort of intersectional, that they really took into account not only the body, not only that sex is about the body, as sexologists, for instance, in the US used to think during the same period, but also we're thinking about sexuality through other factors. So this is important to understand sexuality. We have to think about your upbringing, culture, social status, and also your relationship and everything. So even if everything is okay on the level of physical stimulation, if you are in a violent relationship, sex won't be good. So this is what the sexologists were saying to their patients. So that was this really interesting approach, which was built on patient in conversation with patients. But at the same time, sexology, I don't want to speak about Polish sexology as this really perfect discipline that didn't have any downsides, because it did. So in the book, I focus on two aspects of discussed by sexologists and also by other sex experts on sexual pleasure and on sexual violence. And in both cases, I'm showing that there's a mixture of certain progressivism with conservatism. So on the one hand, there are a lot of progressive laws and various progressive policies that allow women to be active in the workspace. There are progressive laws regarding sexual violence and so on. And there is a massive move towards sexual liberation in the 1970s in Poland. But at the same time, there is also a strong emphasis on traditional gender roles. So the sexual liberation was connected to traditional gender roles. So for instance, Sztuka Kochania, which is the most popular Polish sex book ever, it's being estimated that 7 million copies were sold of the book since its first publication in 1978.
Can you say the title in English?
It's the Art of Love, or the Art of Loving. Yes. There was a huge discussion how to translate it. I think the Art of Loving is closer. The Art of Love is closer, although it's not exactly the meaning. Yeah. So the Art of Love by Michalina Wisłocka had many pages of description of female orgasm, sexual position, and all sorts of technical things, and it was really very pro-sexual book, but at the same time it was so conservative and so traditional when it comes to gender roles in the relationships. So Wisłocka thought about women's agency as something being exercised from behind the scene, and she was really against women's emancipation. So she would say, well, you just cannot be too direct about your needs. You cannot. You should be really feminine in order to keep your husband. So, for instance, she wrote, you can be educated, you can work in science, you can be a professional, or you might be an activist. But at home and in love, a woman must be a woman, and a man must be a man, if they want to live a full life, avoiding disappointments and complexes. And she placed it in this context of stories of her grandmother. Our grandmothers claim that man is a hunter and woman is a bird he preys on. The more difficult to hunt, the more precious. Girls, don't take away from your boys the pleasure of hunting for a treasurer's price. So this is and at the same time, she was saying a lot about orgasm and various techniques and how sex is important for self-realization and for the relationship. So there was this clash between sexual liberation and gender emancipation. But at the same time, this book is not only about sexologists and sex manuals and position and everything, but it's also about Polish women who were and still are active agents, who really work hard to change things, who really fight for the rights. So, and in this period I cover in the book, from the 1970s till almost till 10 years ago when I wrote the book in Polish. So there were various forms of action taken by Polish women to fight for their rights, for the rights to pleasure and for the rights to sexual safety. So would write letters to sexologists demanding pleasure, demanding sexual liberation. So, for instance, let me write a piece of such a letter. So, for instance, Jadzia was writing to the sexologist Zbigniew Lew-Starowicz, who's one of the major figures of Polish sexology. I'm a young married woman, and I belong to the group of women with a clitoral type of orgasm. My husband knows about it, but he doesn't know how to arouse me. He gets tired and annoyed quickly, and he keeps asking me if I'm coming close to orgasming. And then she really demands that the sexologist will educate her husband and will translate to the husband that this is how women's sexuality work and she has the right to her pleasure. And sexologists actually did wrote a lot about women's orgasm and various technical and bodily experiences, and also about the issues such as relationships and love and so on. So that was one example of women, you know, being active agents and changing things. But I think the women even more so intervene in the realm of sexual violence. So Poland, as I said, had under socialism, but also earlier and later, had a very good law when it comes to sexual violence. So violence is understood broadly, and in the 1970s and 80s was understood as outside, as an act against victims' freedom, not as something sexual, but something, the violent act which deprives the person from autonomy. So, and the Supreme Court of Poland in the early 1970s ruled that victims' behaviors before the rape do not justify any violence or any sexual behavior of the rapist. But experts thought about these things differently and presented rape as something really sexual, something that results from provocative women's behavior. So, for instance, Lev Starovich, the same sexologist, wrote some rapes occur because women cross the threshold of sensibility and male self-restraint, and that men are being provoked to rape. And the very same narrative was present in the courtroom. So I study court rape cases, and it was coming back all the time. Although the law didn't define rape as something sexual, the rape was defined in the courtroom as a sexual act resulted from women's provocation, sexual recklessness or provocative behavior. But these things really changed as a result of women's activism. So not only letters sent to sexologists, but also feminist, really formal and informal, intentional action against this. So already in the late 80s and very early 1990s, feminists would organize occasion on which they could talk to sexologists and talk to lawyers that this kind of understanding is really dangerous for women and it should be changed. And they also did it informally. They often knew sexologists from through Planned Parenthood networks. And this is what one of the activists told me. We particularly fought against the concept of the limits of male self-restraint. Sexologists often argued that that there's a certain border, and after crossing it, nothing can be done. So this is exactly what I was just saying earlier about Lev Starovich. And then they were pushing them that they have to change this way of thinking, that there's no border, that everybody knows the situation, that you are in the sexual situation and somebody comes in and then you just stop, for instance. So, and then I trace responses from sexologists, and you can see that under the feminist influence, they really changed their views. So Lev Starovich himself would say, well, some men might think that they cannot stop themselves, but this is not true. Of course they can. And this thinking also influenced what was going on in the courtroom. So then just to connect the book to what's going on now in Poland, because I'm sure that you all saw massive feminist protests on the streets of Warsaw. So if you look at this history of sexuality, of expert discourses of sexuality and sexual activism in Poland, you can see that there is a really strong tradition of Polish women fighting for their rights and succeeding. So this is what I hope will happen now. with abortion protests in Poland, which I think could be like optimistic ending of this short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. Thank you. So I will turn now to Maria Bukur. And those of you who joined us later, a little bit later, and didn't hear my introduction, Maria Bukur is a distinguished professor of East European history and gender studies at Indiana University. And she talks to us from her car because there is a weather condition that doesn't allow her to receive her Wi-Fi at home. And we are all keeping our fingers up and, you know, thumbs up that we hear you well, Maria. Here you are.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for this invitation. This was a very powerful read for me because one thing that you didn't say is I was born and raised in Bucharest, and
right.
I lived there from 1968 until 1985, which means I lived my entire formative time under state socialism, in a country which, by contrast with the Polish case that we heard about just now, had a very different approach to, let's say, bodily autonomy and biopolitics with regard to uteruses in particular and to women's sexuality. And what I'm referring to is that in Romania, starting in 1966, there's a decree that makes abortion illegal for anybody who has not raised 5 live children. That is women, just to be clear who the object is. And that particular policy then becomes further intrusive, to the point that in the 1980s, there are cases, not generally like everywhere in Romania, but in working class areas, women being taken in buses and in trucks to have forced gynecological tests to see if they're pregnant, you know, in a kind of cat-like fashion. So I'm describing a dehumanization of women's agency as sexual beings for the purpose of reproduction on behalf of the socialist state. It is very much in contrast with the kind of story that this book narrates. And so I should say that reading the book for me was complicated because it was such a great contrast to everything I knew that I grew up with. Although there were some similarities, I should say, and maybe I'll speak to that a little bit as well. But the first thing to say, I'm also a historian, not just somebody who grew up in Eastern Europe. I'm a historian of gender, and I have a lot of interest in sexuality, although I myself have not worked in the area of history of sexuality. And the reason is that it's very difficult. So the first thing to say about this book is that the kind of research that Dr. Koscianska has engaged in is exemplary. It's exemplary in the sense that it really gets at how discourse is formed among experts, both in the kind of, you know, hard sense of written analyses, learned, you know, sort of expertise via training in a curriculum, but also the actual experience of being in those places. The kind of, so she did immersive observation, field observation, participant observation of everything from sexology training to going to conferences, to you know, being in groups of survivor support, to see really a 360 perspective of how this discourse is not just laid out initially, but it is recirculated, it is taught, it is learned, and to some extent debated, although it's very clear that the level of criticism that she points at as existing in some circles, especially in feminist psychology circles in Poland, are not criticisms that have had as much impact in how the actual core sexological groups of experts and trainers are behaving. There's several sections in the book where the author talks about the jokes. And I have to say that it's really powerful, and I really hope that you'll say more about that, maybe now, maybe in the future, deconstructing the language, the subtext, the silences. I say this as a feminist scholar because when I read things and, you know, looking at Elżbieta and Shireen here as well, hey, we've both been in academia and at conferences where sexual innuendos are put out by people who are trying to silence a critique of the misogyny that's being perpetrated in various ways at the center of the discourse. I know what she's talking about, and I'm sure everybody else who has been in academia for 20 plus years knows what she's talking about. So that to me was very interesting. And I'm staying on that point because what's in the book is like both about what's obvious and it's also what's in the interstices of how we wink, wink, go along with certain things, and how we also internalize norms, even as we might not agree with them. And I think that has a lot to do with the way in which sexology has actually become influential in Poland, right? I'm sorry to say that I take distance from the claim that sexology in Poland is progressive. After reading this book, I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that there are some critical voices that might be progressive, although progressive has become itself a very complicated word with, you know, almost meaningless sort of labeling qualities to it. However, here's two things that stayed with me that are really important to think about. And these are big numbers, right? So these are both studies done after the end of communism. So we're not talking about anything having to do with how women had good sex or not under communism at this point. I think both of these are from 2016. Agnieszka can correct me. But a study from 2016 shows that 22% of women reported being raped and 23% experienced attempted rape. That to me is 45% of the cis-female population has either experienced attempted sexual violence or is a victim of sexual violence. That is nearly half the population. Progressive, I'm not sure what that means in terms of progressive, if that is the experience that women are having in Poland. It's also, by the way, that it's higher than the WHO average, which is about a third of women around the world have this experience. So that is a big number for me. And it begs the question of what does it mean if you cross-reference that with another very interesting statistic from 2011. So also after the end of communism. This is at the end of the book, we find out that only 7% of women said that had problems achieving orgasm. And so this is evidence of the much greater degree of sexual satisfaction that women have in Poland in relationship to the 30 to 40% women who have that dysfunction in North America, right? So we have these two very different big numbers of huge sexual satisfaction among women. And on the other hand, nearly half the women being either victims or potential victims of sexual violence. What do we make of that, right? And I'd like for our author to maybe speak to that directly. I'll tell you what I think when I read that, which is the high level of sexual satisfaction among women might not have anything to do with men. We all know how to achieve clitoral orgasm. We all do. Don't need a sexological book to do that. And many women do before they read anything about sexology, myself included. So I think that there's some missing dots here between what it means to achieve sexual pleasure, satisfaction, and what that has to do with actual kind of what somebody else is doing in society in relation to that. It's a complicated story. And I think some of the education that we hear about here might be connected to that, but I'm not sure that that's actually the case in terms of how we do sociological correlations versus causation. And when it comes to the rape issues, I'll say one other thing. The section on rape, I have to say, I had a really hard time getting through it because the details there are incredibly triggering. And I'm just saying this for anybody who has an experience with sexual violence. it was really hard to read some of the details, and to then also read the way in which many of these sexologists seem to be really, as Agnieszka rightly pointed out, contributing to the mythology of the victim provoking the rape. There's still a current of that going on. And I wonder if, for instance, the people who were writing about this in the 80s and 90s have not just stepped away from saying those things now, that maybe men are, learning and applying misogynist ways of dealing with rape victims, but also that they themselves were wrong, that they themselves did those things in the past and encouraged them. A self-criticism that's open, that's published, and that can be understood. I know that I've overtaken my time, so I'm gonna shut up now.
And I was hoping actually to ask Shireen for her remarks, but I want Agnieszka in a as short way as possible to address some of those incredibly important points and amazing observations that Maria just made, and then we will move to Shireen. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for all the kind words about the book and the research. So, about rape data, they do not necessarily add. So those women who were raped, they also experience attempt rape. So it's not, it's not clear from the research if there are separated groups that we can add, but still it's really a lot. So yeah, and then I think it's what you said about sexuality, women having sexual pleasure, not thanks to sexologists, but because not thanks to men, but just because of themselves. This is very true, of course, but at the same time, I think that this is what we see in the history of sexuality, that all those expert discourses, we experience sex with them, that it's really difficult, even if you are not a student of sexology, it's really in magazines, in films, and it's this really overwhelming discourse of sexuality which is with us during sex, so it's hard to go away from this. So I think it's of course, and I'm not saying that Polish sexology is particularly progressive. I was just trying to show that there were some elements in this that are really interesting also from today's feminist perspective, like for instance the really complex approach to sexuality. But of course, my book is quite critical when it comes to Polish sexology. And yes, and just briefly about details of rape, it was really difficult research because I spent months in the court archive reading this, and the archive looks like this: that this is in the basement, and you are being locked there. So you cannot get out. If you want to eat something, take a break, or go to a bathroom, you have to call somebody to get you out because there are security measurements, so they lock you there. And I was there with all those files for quite a few months, and I was thinking, should I include those details or not? And at the end, I decided yes, because they will not disappear because if we are silent about this. And then we really have it's my responsibility as a researcher to really show what's the relationship between what's going on in the expert discourse in all those manuals and then in the courtroom, how much these things they really influence. There should be some kind of responsibility on the part of writers and sexologists when they write about rape. I hope that answers more or less major points.
So now we will we are welcoming here to join the conversation Shireen Hassan, who is a Canada Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University, and much more. And here is Shireen.
Thanks, Elżbieta, and thank you, Agnieszka, for an amazing book. I mean, you should all read it. That's, you know, it's a completely engrossing book. And I want to, without repeating everything Maria said, I do want to underline some of that appreciation for the book, because it is a phenomenal task of archival work, but also intellectual work of connecting in this really amazing way. The kind of thing that, you know, those of us who've read Foucault, you know, have this understanding of the way in which official, these discourses constitute sexuality and subjectivity. And what Agnieszka, what you've done in this book is bring together the medical, the juridical, and the psychological in a really, really interesting way to show how they operate, rather than just kind of at the very abstract level theorize it. And so the amount of powerful archival work and the extent to which you have read closely these texts and try to give us a sense of the way in which they all work, not together in any conspiratorial way, because you show so many tensions between the discourses of competing sexologists, the ways in which these get taken up in law journals, and then these voices of ordinary people, as Maria pointed out, people who are writing letters and kind of demanding that the experts help to resolve these microphysical and social questions is just astonishing. When I read this, I was very struck by what you have made of those archives. And reading it from an African perspective is a very interesting thing to do, because the first important point I think that comes out of your book from the epistemology question is that there's this tendency to think about knowledge as happening in silos, right? And often in national contexts. And what your book shows is how much conversation there is across the field, across the different countries in this field of sexology. So that's the first point that I thought your book really, if I were to suggest why people are concerned with what is the big question of decolonization of epistemology, what they would take out of that book is that what you show is how much more complicated it is than simply going to find out what Polish people think, right? Or do that. This is a much larger field of circulation of ideas. But it is interesting from an African perspective to read such a set of archives which don't really exist in other places. So I was thinking as I was reading this about alternative archives, and they are not the archives, obviously, that you are dealing with here, because you are specifically concerned with expert advice and how it works and how these how sexuality is created in these discourses and named. But in the African context, you know, what happened with the colonial gaze, the sexualization of Black women in very particular ways is rampant, unrestrained, dangerous, and so on, is that sexology, maybe that's the wrong word, sex education went underground. And aspects of sex education that took place through other kinds of social processes. So the expert knowledge of the women who were involved in initiation practices for young girls and young boys as well, men and women who were involved in those initiation practices. That's of course constructed as not sexology, not expert knowledge, right? So that's one area in which, in a way, you don't talk about these alternative spaces very much, although you do gesture to the feminist and queer debates. That I wondered, are there other processes of sexual rituals and transmission of knowledge and transmission of ideas. And, you know, some of it, Maria's right, of course, we explore our bodies ourselves in very intimate ways that don't require these official interventions. But there are also other ways in which women pass on knowledge intergenerationally and so on. And I was curious about that. I don't say it's a gap in the book, but it is something that I was thinking about when reading this book, because I was thinking any study like this anywhere in Africa would have to go to that silenced and silent archive, secretive almost. That's an arena in which there is a deliberate secrecy, because to make them public is to make them subject to the gaze, to the public official gaze, which is to invite regulation. So that was the one set of questions I had that really jumped out of the book. The other is around the work that some feminists are now beginning to do in trying to think about sex work as also care work, as also a space in which not simply a kind of instrumental way of addressing sexual needs, but also which is rife, in which sex workers have huge amounts of knowledge. Again, not considered expert, but nevertheless quite wide-ranging. So there's some little moves to try and think about the therapeutic value of involving sex workers in discussions of sexology. And I would be curious to hear about whether that is happening in Poland, or in fact in Eastern Europe more generally. And the kind of so, you know, in terms of your large question of how expert knowledge gets constituted, which you show so well over this period of time, and the way in which you show these shifts, and the ways you show these contestatory discourses, and this sexologists fighting for their ideas to take hold, arguing with lawyers, women arguing back, which is such a nice feature of the book. The sex workers don't feature clearly enough for me in this mapping exercise that you do in parts of the book. So, you know, I'm obviously don't want to say this is, that you could have put this into the book, because what I think readers need to know is that this is a very tightly written book. It's one of those books that somehow manages to keep the big picture while also giving us an incredible amount of historical and narrative detail and experiential detail. Some of it funny, some of it, as Maria pointed out, painful to read and unsettling. A lot of it unsettling, in fact, in multiple ways. So, you know, I raise these questions not to say this is what should have gone into the book, but rather that your book stimulates me to think about these other sorts of continuous areas of knowledge making that are not considered to be knowledge, but nevertheless are maybe very powerful in women's individual women's lives and in collective lives. You talk a little bit at the beginning of the book about projects like Our Bodies, Ourselves. And I think there are multiple kinds of projects like that that are not uncovered yet. And your book encourages us to really start to think about this. So thank you for an absolutely wonderful book and a model of scholarship, in my view, that you know, just is full of treats throughout. So thank you very much, Agnieszka. And I'll stop there.
As I'm listening to that, I think we should have a sequel. We should have a sequel to this conversation, because indeed the book is tight and it opens so many other questions that, you know, we cannot even cover here in a way. But Agnieszka, you have like 2 minutes to answer that?
Yes. Okay. So very briefly, I wrote this book almost 10 years ago. So before the discussion why women had better sex, or if under socialism, and before the topic became really lively discussed in the academia, in the Anglo-Saxon academia. But then the issue it's just so it's also perhaps in this way there are a lot of things I didn't cover which I could cover if I was writing now. But just briefly to what you said regarding alternative archives. So after writing this book, I wrote one more book, which also it's about to come up in English very soon, which is about sex education. And in this other book, I on those alternative archives. And one of them would be what was going on in the countryside. So for instance, I analyze a big body of folk songs. And there are a lot of really educational songs about female sexuality, about female masturbation, female genitals, and so on. So there is a lot of, and these things, just similar to the African context you mentioned, were not perceived sex education or sexology or any form of official knowledge. And it was always presented as something really backwarded and really something you just this is some kind of customary knowledge that nobody should pay any attention in modern society. So and yet sometimes these songs they are really powerful when it comes, especially they're very heteronormative, but when it comes to female sexuality and also female masturbation and female thinking about and women's thinking about their body, they're often very, very powerful. So, and of course there's whole tradition in Poland of feminist self-education. But to your last question on sex work, yes, I think it's this is perhaps one of the things I would include if I was writing now, but at the same time there's not so much to say historically about this, but there is now the whole new activism around sex work in Poland, and also even I saw this one research done by a sexologist, which was based on interviews with sex workers about how they see sexual problems of their clients. So that was some sort of exchange between sexologists and sex workers, although this study was done from a sort of patriarchal, expert knowledge point of view. But I think this is really the field that could be very much developed in the future.
So I want to say one word that would be like five sentences probably. This book for me is, Shireen had mentioned a big picture. There is a big picture and there is a small picture. And I'm looking at that big picture because it's extraordinary contribution to the studies of democratic transformation, so-called transitions to democracy, which we always thought, and Maria mentioned that, I mean, it's a progress. Now this is the regress. This is the story of the regress. It's not progressive, it's regressive. When I went first to Poland, after not being there for 8 years in 1981, I noticed myself the kind of a pair of striking paradoxes. And I think that this book is about the paradoxes. And that's why it's so also exciting and involving. And the thing that I noticed concerning the situation of women throughout the region, I think, and then I made the research. So it was throughout the region. And I did not go to Romania. And in Romania, it's exceptional situation. And you're absolutely right. And it's that regime tightly controlled by the Ceausescus, and that's a separate thing. And you mentioned why, Maria. First of all, for many in public life, the first paradox, for many people in public life, the most rewarding behavior in the first years of post-communism seemed to be that which focused on eradicating all remnants of the previous system, which included, ironically, it's never fulfilled commitments to women's rights in particular. Yeah, there was something, and there was a lot of new right about it. The second paradox was that the spheres of relative freedom, and you are talking about it, you know, the kind of the newspapers, some newspapers which were or a magazine addressed to smaller audiences, but also church, which were the spheres of freedom, relative freedom, available under communist rule. Or in Hungary, in Poland it was church, in Hungary it was second economy, in Czechoslovakia it was a certain focus on family and so on, had now for women became the spheres of constraint. And the whole situation was additionally complicated by the a priori negative at that time attitudes towards feminism in this part of Europe. So I think it's extraordinary, people who do study the changes that have happened. And you know, what was lost and what was gained, and how one can talk about it. Should read Agnieszka's book, and I think with this regression, we will better, not progression, not progress, but regress, we will understand better the presence of women on the streets and plazas of Warsaw.
Can I say something about the rape statistics question? Yeah. Because that sort of fits into, I think, the larger point Agnieszka is making, is that once you start to name something, then you start to count something, right? But what you are counting are often the expert definitions of what that thing is. And rape statistics are very difficult to work with because of that, because the naming practices are tied to operations of power, how a law defines it or how some set of officials define it. But it's also tied to this question of transition, because as we have had more discussion and debate and public kind of contestation around this, we have created a sense of awareness about its extent. So for me, it's a complicated field to read. Reading rape statistics, for me, I feel like I always want to know, well, how was the definition used in the survey? Who was asked, you know, and so on. You know, we saw the same thing in South Africa after 1994. On the surface, it looked like the extent of sexual violence had dramatically gone up. But in part, that's because we were opening up the space to measure it and ask questions about it, and sort of making room for it to be named and counted in the public sphere.
So
I was going to say it's a difficult.
Our only male colleague has just joined us at the end of this conversation, and I'm sure he has questions because he is a specialist on the area, on the region. But he also read some other people's questions. So Jeff Goldfarb, professor of sociology at the New School for Social Research and the head of the Democracy Seminar, is here with us. We don't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Agnieszka, I noticed that you wanted to speak before Elżbieta turned to me. So why don't you say what you want to say?
Okay. Yeah, just very briefly to both what Elżbieta said and then what Shireen said. That I think that when I think about this book as a book about transition, I think there's also another element, that there is certain that we cannot just simply think before 89 and after 89, because these are the same people, the same institutions, the same discourses, that they are there in operation. And it's not a rupture. There are a lot of continuities between the 80s and the 90s and before. So I think what I really wanted to say in the context of progress or regress is that there are a lot of continuities and changes, and they are small, and that this story is not it's not a linear story as we tend to think, that there's certain big change, a linear progress, but these things are way more complicated. and I think this is also a huge success of all the recent publications on sexuality under socialism, and the discussions around Kristen Gotzi column "Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism," that it really opened up the field for more nuanced look at transition and sexuality and feminism in the region. And just a very brief comment to what Shireen said about rape statistics. You can see really similar things in Poland, because official statistics after World War II, there are no rapes. There are just 200 rapes or 300 years a year in 30 and then 35 million country. And then they really began to grow in the 1970s, when there are some discursive tools to talk about them. But still, the number of official rapes in comparison to the research done by Magda Grabowska, which Maria quoted, when there's 20 or 25% of women being raped or attempted or being victims of other forms of violence, there's still a huge gap between official statistics and women's experience when they are asked in a, let's say, feminist way about their experience, and in a really friendly environment of feminist viewing. So yeah, so I think there's still a huge work to be done when it comes to sexual violence in Poland.
So I actually was going to say something to that effect. I mean, I am struck by how Polish sexology is, and how continuous it is. So that I know everything I know about Polish sexology, I know from your book. This is, and I'm very, very grateful that you wrote it, because I think it's a very important topic, and it also provides a very, very interesting window into Polish social life, but social life more generally. I think it's really an extraordinary study. But I say it's very, very Polish because I know something about Polish sociology, not sexology. And Polish sociology has the same general character and has this similar continuities. So that, interwar Polish sociology was distinctive. It was humanistic. Polish sexology is distinctive. It was humanistic. Post-war, the same thing. Post-socialist, yet again, the same thing. So there's a very, very interesting continuity in both disciplines. So that leads me actually to ask a question having to do with how, and I'm going to ask this question also keeping in mind an issue raised by Colton Lee. His question was simply, in the end, there's a preamble. He knows something. I think it's a he. I'm not sure. I should say they. But it comes down to asking the question if the panelists would speak to comparing sex, not sexology, how it's regarded in Poland versus other nations. And for me, you have a Foucaultian bias. That is, you're interested in the discipline and showing how discipline forms experience. And biases, or I say you use a Foucaultian insight. And I'm interested in turning it around. What strikes me is how other institutions and everyday practices actually constitute the discipline, constitute the experience of sex, sexuality, and the study of both, and of gender. I'm struck by the fact that how the political currents in Poland lead to the twists and turns of Polish sexology. And then I wonder, what is the role of the state, and the transition focuses on the change of the political economy, but then of media, and then absolutely crucially, the church. So I think the kinds of issues that Maria raised earlier about kind of the problems of sexual violence in Polish society, in light of overwhelming the progressive, in quotes, significance of Polish sexology, I think that the church plays an extraordinarily important role in this, which is not, I'm not criticizing you, but I'm actually noticing that these extra-disciplinary forces actually account for the continuities as well as the discontinuities, but especially the continuities. So I'll conclude my remarks by returning to the question, and that is, how does the experience of sex and sexual and gender violence, how does that, in what ways do you think Poland compares to other countries, let's say South Africa, Romania, and the United States?
Before Agnieszka answers, I wanted to say that we are going, I hope, Lala, we can stay a few minutes longer, but I know that Maria has to drive off and teach.
I gotta go get my vaccine, people.
Oh yeah, right.
Vaccine. Okay, and so just to make sure that if she disappears, it was because she had to. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to have to go in a minute or two as well. So, yeah.
Could I just answer very quickly, because I think about this a lot. So, Jeff, I think one of the ways to compare Poland is through the framework of the Istanbul Convention that Poland just left last year in October, right? In a transnational framework in which, a significant number of countries, most of them in the EU, but not all of them, have committed themselves to fighting gender violence through forms of education, through forms of, first and foremost, putting victims at the center of the conversation and empowering them to generate discourses, research, findings, solutions. That is the core of the Istanbul Convention. The extent to which Poland can do that without being part of the Istanbul Convention, saying that they wanted to leave it for their own reasons, the Catholic Church and the Law and Justice Party are very much implicated with that, right?
Agnieszka is dying to say something.
But Poland didn't leave the Istanbul Convention. It was ratified years ago. And of course, our current government would like to not to be a part of, of this, but nothing has been done. And Poland is still... Okay. But of course, you are totally right that the state really pushes, does everything to de-ratify the convention and saying that this is against Polish tradition and it's a gender ideology. So luckily, not yet. And
so I was mistakenly reading, the news. But in the United States, of course, the Violence Against Women Act is still not been funded for 2 years, just so people understand what's going on. And the reason is because people who are implicated with the Second Amendment and with the NRA are refusing to sign on to the notion that people who have a history of domestic violence should not own guns. That the reason for that is because 50% of the population that participates in mass shootings are also perpetrators of domestic violence, a lot of it being also sexual to some extent or psychological. So things are not all that great in this country. The Istanbul Convention is somewhat of a measurement transnationally, but that's my last remark. And I'm gonna have to sign off, I'm sorry. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for doing us a huge service intellectually. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So should I briefly
Yes.
reply to?
Yeah, I don't know how we are, Lala. Could you just say, can we stay a few more minutes? And we still have some people with us, so can you stay? We can stay a few more minutes, right?
Yes,
Lala?
we can stay.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to have to go though.
Okay, right now?
Yeah, because we are over time already.
Sorry.
Shireen will disappear and Agnieszka will have the last word.
Okay, thank you, Shireen, so much for
Pleasure.
being with us.
Thank you for a great book. Really, really great book.
Thank you. So just briefly to compare sex in Poland to other contexts, which I cannot do in other way than through Foucauldian terms, because how can you measure sex anyway? So then just to give you an example, maybe not finish with violence, but just finish with something more so dramatic, at least. So when Polish sexologists were talking about all the social, cultural, and political context that creates sexuality and should be at the core of sexual therapy, at the very same time in the 1970s in the US, sexology was built around the model built by Masters and Johnson, which was very much based on the body and how the body reacted to sex without any social context. And I think that really shows the difference, how much in Poland thinking about sexuality, relations, and everything is always very traumatic, and it's always about so much context and not about the body. While if you compare it to the US, it's way more embedded in the bodily experience and less placed in all these 100 other things that could happen with sex. So I guess Poles are way more thinking about this for other things, and therefore sexuality is being a little bit maybe out of what we talk about it, maybe a little bit taboo, but still it's just a different tradition of approaching this, and not necessarily worse.
I have to say something. That's what I meant by it being very Polish.
Yeah.
I think that when we think about these things, we have to kind of think about how these kind of lived everyday experiences are often in contrast to official accounts. So there's a sense in which what you're describing, contrary to the anti-gender attacks, that a concern for a richer understanding of gender and a richer understanding of sexuality, flawed though they are, is in fact very Polish.
Well, but that's a good thing.
It's a very, very good thing. And contrary to the ideological attacks, there is a tradition of that, gender isn't a foreign concern with gender in a kind of nuanced way, and sexuality in a nuanced way is actually embedded in a Polish tradition.
Yeah, and Polish sexologists already in the 1970s used the term, and they didn't use the English term gender, but they used the meaning of this.
Right.
Showing that płeć, Polish term for this, is just embedded in various realms such as society and culture.
Agnieszka, thank you.
Yeah, we have to finish.
Thank you very much for the fantastic book, which I think could be used and referenced by very different people, very different specialists and experts in the humanities and social sciences, because it is about the most the ultimate human behavior, I think, that we don't really talk and write much about, but it's also about politics, it's also about knowledge, it's also about suffering, and it's also about oppression. So I like you guys to take a look at that. It's a great cover, Warsaw, with the Palace of Culture on it. Buy the book. Buy the book. Read the book. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Great experience.
Thank you.